I urge the government to relist the bills for consideration by the Senate.
Thank you, Senator Pocock. Senator Rennick.
Deputy President, and what can I say? This motion today is just money for jam, and it really just proves what we've been saying for a very long time, and that is the Labor Party is the party for the big end of town. And it's interesting. I'll slightly disagree with the wording of my good friend and colleague Senator Braggs, where he says the Assistant Treasurer Stephen Jones to appropriately consult in regards to this. I'd actually disagree with that because, as it turns out, he got all the consulting he needed. He got a phone call from the former Queensland Labor Premier, Anna Bligh, who of course is now the head of the Australian Banking Association. Now, if you want a good example of just how close the big end of town, the banks, are to the Labor Party, look no further than who's the head of the Australian Banking Association, former Queensland Premier Anna Bligh. And what was Anna Bligh famous for up in Queensland? We call her the Minister for Privatisation. She sold all of Queensland's all the assets that belong to the Queensland people, the Queensland forestry plantations, which are freehold, for 5 times earnings. 5 times earnings. She sold the Port of Brisbane for 6 times earnings, a 99-year lease for 6 times earnings. Gave our assets away to the mates in the big end of town and to her mates in the superannuation funds. And of course she's got her payback. She's got her 30 pieces of silver. And of course, who is the master puppet pulling the strings behind former Queensland Premier Anna Bligh? No less a person than the Minister for Agriculture at the moment, current Senator Murray Watt, who is the Chief of Staff for all this. So we know that the Labor Party is in thick with the big end of town. I mean, we hear Senator Watt talking all the time how he engages with industry groups in agriculture. Well, let me tell you, as a 6th-generation farmer, we don't engage with industry groups. We're too busy out in the paddock working to be hanging out with the big end of town, the blowhards. No, 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 no. This is not a party that cares about the workers. Let me tell you that. This is not a party that cares about the workers. And the history of the Labor Party and getting into bed with the big banks goes back, there's another great example of how they sold the CBA. And of course, Senator Ayres was talking earlier on about how there's all this bad behaviour in the big banks. I'll tell you why there was bad behaviour in the big banks, because you privatised CBA without any regulation. At the same time, you introduced superannuation, where basically people are being the workers, having their money taken from them, given to these financial planners, many of whom started working for the big banks. I mean, remember the 90s? CBA bought Colonial Mutual, National Bank bought National Mutual, Westpac did a joint venture with Bankers Trust, and ANZ did a deal with ING. So it's the big banks again. I mean, I often say that the industry super funds are out there good mates with Labor, but it's also the private sector as well that's very good mates with Labor. And of course, as I've always said, and I have to sometimes remind my colleagues on this side of the chamber, that Robert Menzies himself said in the Forgotten People speech that the rich and powerful can look after themselves. He made it very clear that we're about people that want to get out of bed every day and put their nose to the grindstone. And of course, the Minister for Stephen Jones, he doesn't know whether he's Arthur or Martha, because he's thought he was going to get in there and save the world, and he suddenly realised that the lobbyists, and I spoke about this last week, the Courier Mail reported it, lobbyists should disclose who pays them. It's not just political parties, because I tell you who's pulling the strings in the world. It's not us. I mean, I've often thought about engaging a lobbyist myself to get something done around here. So I can tell you, as an elected member, I'm not getting much done, as an elected representative of the people. But let me tell you, a phone call from Anna Bligh and Stephen Jones, the Minister for Whitlam, just suddenly pulls the fees for the big end of town, and that is just so typical of the Labor Party of today. I mean, they tell me that the seismographs are going off in Bathurst, where Ben Chiefeley's rolling in his grave. King O'Malley rolling in his grave, the great man who actually started the Commonwealth Bank way back then, and it was also part of the Reserve Bank, and they actually had a business bank and they funded this stuff. So I'm very glad, and I think the Labor Party need to take a really good look at themselves, because this is not a party that stands up for the working class anymore. They are a party for the big end of town, And of course, we know that. We aren't surprised because the first thing they did, Stephen Jones did, was remove the disclosure requirements for super funds. I mean, I tell you what, this guy, he's the minister for, as the Australian Financial Review called him, the minister
Rennick, your
for the
time
dog's
has
proverbial.
expired, and the time for discussion on this MPI has also expired. I shall now proceed